Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, celebrating 55 years of ministry.
Andrew, I can't thank you enough for taking the vision that God showed you and being so faithful with it.
You honor God's word, you honor His Spirit.
Thank you for listening to God, because so many lives have been changed.
And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to our Monday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today is the beginning of my 5th and final week of teaching on spirit, soul, and body. Now, actually, whatever I teach is going to continue based on this revelation, but this is my 5th and final week to just teach on spirit, soul, and body. And as I've said many times, this is what just transformed my life, these truths. And I believe that this is the missing link for most people. So please get this. I'm giving this as my gift to you. There's no charge to it. It's a 160-page book. We'll send it to you. We've also got it in CD and DVD and USB and audio book and illustrated, a little illustration cartoon type of thing that goes along with it. We've just got all kinds of ways. Any way that you want this teaching, we've got it available. And this coming Friday will be my last day to offer this over television. So please go to the effort of getting this. Let me just share again, I've covered a lot of the basics. What I'm doing now is just drilling down, magnifying certain things and making application of this truth that it's your spirit that got born again, not your soul and not your body. Your soul and your body are subject to change, but they aren't changed yet. Your spirit is a part of you that was old things passed away and all things became new, 2 Corinthians 5:17. And so I've talked about a lot of things about how that you've been forgiven of all sin, past, present, and future, out of Hebrews chapter 9 and chapter 10. I've talked about how that you're sealed by the Holy Spirit, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 13, that God is a spirit, that those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth, John chapter 4, verse 24. And I've talked about that we are righteous. It's a gift of righteousness. We were made righteous through Jesus, not through what we do. I've covered a lot of things. I want to make an application right here that this really helped me. And this is out of Romans chapter 6. And again, the book of Romans is Paul's masterpiece on grace. He's showing that it's what Jesus did for us and not what we do for Jesus that is the power of God. He starts in Romans 1:16, that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So right there in Romans 1:16, he makes radical statements about the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, which in the religious tradition of his day, as well as the religious tradition of our day, there isn't a lot of good news. They'll say that yes, God can do anything. He can deliver, heal, prosper, but it's all based on how holy you live. And that makes it all bad news, because even though God has this available, we know that we aren't worthy. But the good news is that you don't get it based on what you do. You get it based on what Jesus did. And so that's what he began to teach, and he goes and uses Abraham and David as examples, and he brings the people to a place that at the end of chapter 5, matter of fact, on last Friday's programs, I was using these exact verses. Let me just read a couple of these. It says in verse 19, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. You are made righteous not through you, what you do, not according to your actions, but through one man, talking about Jesus. You were made righteous. In verse 20, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. And so this is just saying multiple times in the end of this that you are made righteous through what Jesus did. And so if you preach the same gospel that the Apostle Paul preached, there are 4 times, twice right here in Romans chapter 6, and then over in Galatians it says it 2 more times. But he comes to this place and he says, what shall we say then? Romans 6:1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? This question came up 4 different times in Paul's teaching. And the answer is, he says, God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? No, he is not teaching that because we are righteous through what Jesus did that we can just go live in sin. I'm not preaching that. But if that question never comes up, then you haven't heard the same gospel that the Apostle Paul preached, because it came up 4 times in his writings. And it does make a logical sense that if we are totally forgiven of all sin, past, present, and future, I taught on that 2 weeks ago, Hebrews chapter 9 and chapter 10. If we're forgiven of all sin, even the ones that we haven't committed, does that mean we can just go live in sin? No, that's not what that says. If you understand the love of God, the grace of God that He's extended towards us, that will cause you to live holier accidentally than you ever have on purpose before. It will just captivate your heart and you will wind up serving God. You won't do it perfectly because none of us are perfect, and when you do fail, there is plenty of grace to cover it. But I guarantee you, any person who would say that, man, I'm free in Christ to just go live in sin, you don't even know Christ. That's a big statement, but I believe that that's true. So he says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? What does it mean that we are dead to sin? This doesn't mean we're incapable of sin. Man, there are many scriptures I could use, but all throughout the New Testament, there are examples of people who were truly born again, and yet they were rebuked for doing the wrong thing, and God accepted them and loved them. They did not lose their salvation. Just by observation, all of us can tell that we sin. We fall short. Sin is not only when you make a direct transgression against one of the big 10, like the 10 Commandments, but it says in James 4:17, to him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. Romans 14:23 says, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So anytime you know you're supposed to be doing better than you're doing and you fail, that's sin. Anytime that you aren't in faith, that is sin. And so if you use the Bible definition of what sin is, all of us sin and we come short. But what does it mean when it says we are dead to sin? That's talking about this new born-again spirit. Let me turn over to 1 John chapter 3 and read something to you that used to be a real problem to me, but this teaching on spirit, soul, and body explained it to me. Right here in 1 John chapter 3 and in verse 8, it says, he that committeth sin is of the devil, for the devil sinneth from the beginning. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that He might destroy the works of the devil. And then it says in verse 9, whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. What in the world does that mean? Because as we were just saying, all of us have sinned. All of us continue to sin. If you use the Bible definition that it's what you should be doing that you aren't doing, anything that's not of faith is sin, well then all of us fall short and we are not the person that we're supposed to be. So how can you reconcile what we experience with what the Word of God says? To me, the key is this teaching right here, spirit, soul, and body. Your spirit is the only part of you that is born of God. Whatsoever is born of God doth not commit sin. For his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. Your spirit is the only part of you that is born of God. Your body is not born of God. Someday you're going to get a glorified body that will be born of God, and it'll be perfect. Someday you'll get a glorified soul where you'll know all things the way that you should know. But right now, the only part of you that is born of God is your spirit, and it cannot sin. Man, that's awesome to me. I love that. And I used to struggle with that because I knew I was born of God. I had the witness within myself. Romans chapter 8, 1 John chapter 5 says we have a witness in ourselves and we know that we've passed from death unto life. I was in fellowship with the Lord and I knew that I knew God, and yet I failed and I didn't always operate in faith, and there was things I knew I was supposed to do that I wasn't doing correctly. And so because of it, I just was saying, God, I don't understand this, because it says if you're born of God, you cannot sin. The only part of you that is born of God is your spirit, and it is sinless, and it cannot sin. There is no sin. There is no propensity for sin on the inside of you. Man, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I know that there are people that have been trained under religion that you're saying, but wait a minute. I not only have my born again spirit, I've got this old sin nature on the inside of me, and man, it can sin. I don't believe you do. Let's go back to Romans chapter 6. It says, God forbid, how shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? Know ye not that so many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into His death? Therefore we are buried with Him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of His death, we shall be also in the likeness of His resurrection, knowing this. You know, man, this is just all powerful, but let me break in right here and say that some people think that we still have a new nature and we've got the old sinful nature on the inside of us. Now, don't misunderstand. We were all born with a sinful nature. Psalms chapter 51, David said, in sin did my mother conceive me. And that's not talking about her conceiving David outside of marriage. It's just talking about that we were all born with a sin nature. Ephesians chapter 2 says we were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. And so every one of us was born with a sin nature. So I admit that yes, every person had a sin nature. But when you get born again, that old man died. And you know, there's some things I want to say here that are really not that complicated, but what makes it complicated, it is so against everything that is taught in most churches today. Matter of fact, even many translations, the NIV translation of Romans chapter 6 and chapter 7 totally misses this point. The NIV continually talks about our old sinful nature doing these things. These verses, I'm going to read them and go back through here, but this says that when you get born again, that old sinful nature is gone. You don't have a sinful nature if you've been born again. And I know some people are saying, oh, yes, I do, because you see it manifest so often. But that's what this is talking about. Your sinful nature has been gone and it's been replaced with a born again, brand new nature. But you aren't only a spirit, you got a soul, which is your mental, emotional part, and your body. And your soul is kind of like the operating program in a computer. Did you know a computer has a hard drive and it's got all of these things loaded on it, but it's your operating system. It's the software that makes you use that stuff. When we get born again, we got a brand new nature on the inside of us, but we've still got the old operating system. We've got to renew our mind. We got to reprogram ourselves. It is not a nature that compels you to live in sin as a Christian. It is an unrenewed mind. And this is exactly what Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 says. It says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto Him, which is your reasonable service. And verse 2 says, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The way you get transformed is through the renewing of your mind. And yet the average Christian, what they're doing is saying, oh God, I just need more faith. God, I need joy. God, I need love. I've already taught on this in this series, but those things are already in your spirit. You don't need them to come from the outside. You need them to come from the inside, and they won't come from the inside until you renew your thinking. And as long as you think that, well, I'm just an old sinner saved by grace. I've still got this old sinful man on the inside of me, and it's compelling me to live in sin, then you might resist sin for a period of time. You may give token resistance to it, but after a while, you'll give in because that's the way you see yourself. I am an old sinner. This is who I am. I'm a drunk. I'm a drug addict. I'm a prostitute. I'm whatever. And this, you see that is your nature, and you may resist it and fight against it, but if the temptation continues, you'll give in because after all, that's the way you see yourself. But if you could see that, no, I am dead to sin. My new nature, it cannot sin. There is nothing compelling me to sin except an unrenewed mind. You know, right now, I button this shirt. I don't remember buttoning this shirt, to tell you the truth, but I know I did because nobody else dressed me. But when I was a kid, I remember I used to really struggle to button my shirt. I don't know why, but for some reason, it just wasn't a big thing to me. And I remember my dad sitting me down. I'm old enough to remember this. And he says, you are going to learn how to button your shirt. And he sat there and made me start buttoning my shirt correctly. And so my point in bringing this up is to say that I don't even remember doing this. It's like it was my nature. It just happened automatically. But I can prove to you that it wasn't the way I was born. I remember having to learn how to do this, but I've done it so many times now that I can just do it. And it seems like it's my nature, but it's an acquired trait. And the reason I bring that out is to say that some of us think, well, it's just my nature to gossip. It's just my nature to be depressed. It's just my nature to be angry and to do all of these things. And you think that because you observe this tendency towards sin, that somehow or another that's because you've got a sinful nature. These scriptures are saying, no, that sinful nature is gone. But the only reason it seems like it's still, the propensity is still there, that you still are drawn towards it, is because you have trained yourself. You have taught yourself. You have programmed yourself how to live in sin. That old sinful nature that we had on the inside of us programmed us to be selfish, programmed us to be angry and to be bitter and to love money and being the root of all evil. It programmed all of these things. And even though you've now got a new nature, you're going to continue to function the way you were programmed until you reprogram it. That's what Romans chapter 12 verse 2 says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You could say the reprogramming of your mind. The only reason that you are still living in sin, if you are a born-again Christian, is because you haven't reprogrammed yourself. Your nature is different and it cannot sin. You cannot sin in your born-again nature, and that old sinful nature is taken out of you. So let me go back and read some of these verses again. In verse 4 it says, therefore we are buried with Him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of His death, this is something that happens at salvation. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 talks about we were all baptized into His body. So if we have been planted together in the likeness of His death through salvation, we shall be also in the likeness of His resurrection, knowing this. Now, this phrase in verse 6 changes everything. See, in verse 5, we have been planted in the likeness of His death. That's a done deal. But walking in the likeness of His resurrection is dependent upon knowing this. If you don't know something, then this resurrection life will not function on the inside of you. So you've got to know the truth before you get made free. John chapter 8, verse 32. So here's what you've got to know. You have to know that your old man is crucified with Him. Crucifixion is where something dies. And it uses this terminology many different times, and yet people who still believe that we have an old sinful nature, they'll say, oh yeah, we're crucified with Him, but we resurrect every morning. And you got to die to yourself every single day. That's imputing resurrection power to the devil and to this old sinful nature that the Bible doesn't do. And as we continue to go through these verses, I won't be able to do all of this today. I'm running short of time, but as I continue to go through this chapter, it'll say it over and over and over that you are dead to sin the same way that Jesus is dead to sin. And He doesn't die anymore, and sin no longer has any dominion over Him. This is not saying that, yes, you died to that old sinful nature, but that sinful nature resurrects every day and that you got to die to it again. I was actually taught this. I remember as a teenager, before I really had my relationship with the Lord in 1968, I used to imagine myself being strapped into an electric chair and dying to my flesh, dying to myself every day. And I would imagine myself strapping myself in and saying, hatred or lust or whatever it is that I was doing. And I would mention all of my sins and think that by mentioning these sins, I was somehow or another dying to myself. What I was doing was empowering self by focusing on self and how bad self was. And I tried all of that. And I know a lot of people that are just constantly trying to die to themselves. But these verses say that you have already died to that old sinful nature. I know somebody's thinking, well, what about Paul saying I die daily? That's out of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And if you take it in context, he was just saying, why even, put up with all of this? He says, I fought with beasts at Ephesus. I faced death constantly. Why do I do this if there isn't a resurrection? Because I die daily. That wasn't talking about him somehow or another dying to his old flesh and his old sinful nature. He was just saying, I face death on a daily basis. Why would I do this if there wasn't a resurrection? Again, that's a religious teaching that people draw on to say that every day you're just supposed to be so sin conscious and dying to yourself constantly. That's not what it's talking about. So again, in verse 5, if we have been planted together in the likeness of His death, which has happened at salvation, we shall be also in the likeness of His resurrection, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with Him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. Man, I'm out of time, and I'm just to a place of saying something really, really important. So once again, please get this book. This coming Friday is going to be my last day to offer this over my television programs. It's a 160-page book. I'm giving it away as a gift. There's no strings attached. You can get it. We've got the same book in Spanish right here. We've got study guides. We've got DVDs, CDs, USBs. We have an audio book, and we even have an illustrated version of this where someone is drawing this out and illustrating it as I talk about it. So listen to our announcer. He's going to give you information. Remember that this coming Friday is going to be my last day to offer this book as a free gift and all of the rest of this product. So listen to our announcer as he gives you this information, and then please call or write today.